right, so let's take a look at the law of God, chapter 19. All right, so God gave Adam a law as a covenant of works by which he bound him and all his posterity to personal, entire, exact, and perpetual obedience, promised life upon the fulfilling and threatened death upon the breach of it, and endued him with power and ability to keep it. This law, after his fall, continued to be a perfect rule of righteousness, and as such was delivered by God upon Mount Sinai in 10 commandments and written in 2 tablets. The first 4 commandments containing our duty towards God, and the other 6 our duty to man. Besides this law, commonly called moral, God was pleased to give the people of Israel as a church under age ceremonial laws containing several typical ordinances, partly of worship, prefiguring Christ, his graces, actions, sufferings, and benefits, and partly holding forth diverse instructions of moral duties, all which ceremonial laws are now abrogated under the New Testament. To them also, as a body politic, he gave sundry judicial laws, which expired together with the state of that people, not obliging any other now further than the general equity thereof may require. The moral law doth forever bind all, as well justified persons as others, to the obedience thereof, and that not only in regard of the matter contained in it, but also in respect of the authority of God the Creator who gave it. Neither doth Christ in the gospel any way dissolve, but much strengthen his obligation. Although the true believers be not under the law, as a covenant of works, to be thereby justified or condemned, yet it is of great use to them as well as to others, in that, as a rule of life informing them of the will of God and their duty, it directs and binds them to walk accordingly. That's right, part 6 is really, really long. 3 slides. Discovering also the sinful pollution of their nature, hearts, and lives, so as examining themselves thereby they may come to further conviction of, humiliation for, and hatred against sin, together with a clear sight of the need they have of Christ, and it's a Reynolds sentence, and the perfection of his obedience. Oh, there we go, there's a period. It is likewise of use to the regenerate to restrain their corruptions, and that it forbids sin, and the threatenings of it serve to show what even their sins deserve, and what afflictions in this life they may expect for them, although freed from the curse thereof threatened in the law. So basically saying, this is what you deserve, but you're also not getting. See? The promises of it in like manner show them God's approbation of obedience and what blessings they may expect upon performance thereof, although not as due to them by the law as a covenant of works, so as a man's doing good and refraining from evil, because the law encourageth to the one and deterreth from the other, is no evidence of his being under the law and not under grace.
Somebody's been reading way too much Paul.
Yes. It's got Paul written all over that.
Yes,
right, yes. Yeah, well, yeah, you see, 2 Corinthians, Ephesians, there are some Psalms in there too, but
I was just thinking about how
Romans.
the run-on sentences.
Oh, that too, yeah. That's like Ephesians, the first chapter. It just keeps going and going and going and going. Yeah, that's right. All right, so 6 is done, now 7. So neither are the aforementioned uses of the law contrary to the grace of the gospel, but do sweetly comply with it, the Spirit of Christ subduing and enabling the will of man to do that freely and cheerfully, which the will of God revealed in the law requireth to be done. Whew. Okay, so let's dig into what all this means. Obviously, the aim of this chapter, then, I think, is to explain the ongoing role of the law, the moral law, really, of all the laws, because what it says is some of them are not ongoing, in the life of the Christian, and the ways that it's also no longer binding. Now, this is a debated subject, even among various branches of Reformed Protestantism, among Protestants and also among the Reformed itself, in our small little tiny camp on the Christian scene. Even we have different takes on this, okay? We'll get into that a little bit. But much of the debate is all about what is meant by law. Like when Paul says the word law, when Jesus says the word law, are they talking about the same thing? Are they talking about different things? Sometimes it just isn't clear all the time in all the contexts where it appears. So So people have drawn different conclusions and have come away with different interpretations. It's something that has been hotly debated by many. But essentially, this chapter explains the ongoing role of the law in the life of the Christian in the ways it's no longer binding. And this, I didn't realize I repeated myself. Sorry about that. Some of the debate, though, that's a repeat as well. Okay. The confession distinguishes between moral, ceremonial, and civil laws in the Old Testament. And that's what the confession is presenting, the traditional Reformed view, which also was held by the Church of England, the Anglican tradition. The 39 Articles of Religion is what they held to, and their presentation or their discussion about the law is very much the same. It's a very Reformed document, actually. The Continental or Dutch Reformed documents also present basically the same outlook on the law and its relevance for the Christian. So, as the Westminster Confession. But the confession distinguishes between these three: moral, ceremonial, and civil. But other traditions see such distinctions as too artificial, and that the New Testament use of law includes all of them. So they think that when Paul says you're not under law but under grace, he's talking about all of that. Or some say just some of that. Some say just the penalty of the law. He's not talking about the moral side of it, but just the penalty of it. And then there's also debate about what Jesus means when he says he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. People have taken that in different directions, because it's interesting, because he said I didn't come to abolish it. And Paul will say later that Jesus did abolish it. Of course, he's not contradicting Jesus. He means in what sense did he abolish it? He abolished the barriers that the law set up between Jew and Gentile. That's what he's talking about. So he certainly knocked that wall down. That was abolished, that dividing wall. But as far as the requirements of it, the demands of holiness, he did not abolish. So these are just a sampling. There's other views, other nuanced views. In fact, there's a book. I meant to bring it out just so you could see it. There's a series that Zondervan did of different, like 4 views of this and 5 views of that. There's one called 5 Views of Law and Gospel that I own. I had it on the shelf in the prayer room in there, and I pulled it off the shelf, took it to my office, meaning to bring it out here, but instead I locked it in my office. So it's not out here like I intended. I meant to grab that, I forgot to. But anyways, in that book, there's actually two Reformed guys who present their view. The traditional Reformed view is presented by William Van Gimeren, who is kind of a known he's like a Greek, Hebrew. I think he's an Old Testament scholar. And then there's the theonomic Reformed view of the law, okay, or sometimes just called theonomy, or Reconstructionism. You've probably heard that term before, the term theonomic. So you've heard Reconstructionism, what that is? Mm-hmm. Essentially, it's God's law should be the law of the land, of any land. And that's what a lot of them push for, is that even America should have the law of Moses as its law. So we should be stoning people for various things and that sort of thing. So that's the theonomic view, and the one who presents that in the book is Greg Bonson. He was known for his apologetics, which his apologetics was very good, but when it came to his theonomy, he was a little bit too harsh and rigid, in my opinion. But this is what he would do. And I heard this, that him being a theonomist, he would say on the floor of presbytery when a guy was being examined, he would say something like, "Is it okay to have sex with animals?" And the guy would say, "No." "Well, how do you know that?" "Well, because it says in the Bible, the law." "Oh, so the law's still in effect then?" Is that what you're saying? "Well, yeah, So that's how he would prove his point. He always, because these guys like to make their point, the floor of presbytery. So, because they're not just talking to the candidate, they're talking to everyone else around them, kind of proving their point, making their case. So that's more or less kind of where they're coming from. And they would say that unless a law is clearly abrogated in the New Testament, it remains binding. Old Testament law should be enforced in our country. I already mentioned that as well, or some of their views. But then there's the Lutheran view, which is interesting because I've always kind of thought, okay, this is what the Lutheran view is, but then I read something just to catch up on it, clarify a few things, and read a Lutheran guy saying, nobody understands the Lutheran view. Everyone mischaracterizes. This is really what Lutherans believe about law and gospel. Okay, all right, so we got it all wrong. But essentially, the way I understood it was there's a sharp distinction between law and gospel. Almost they see them as opposites, as like opposed to one another. The law and the gospel are not friends. They don't get along, so to speak, in the person's life. But what he said, which I think it says the law condemns and the gospel saves, and it's that simple. The law is always going to beat you up. The law is always going to tear you up. The law is always going to condemn you and just show you how horrible you are. But the gospel is always going to, do the opposite, have the opposite effect. It saves. It's going to encourage you. It's going to bless you. And I think that's generally true. The law does do that, but there is grace in the law. Mm-hmm. Just the fact that God gave his people the law was grace. He chose them. He loved them. He showed them his goodness and protected them, and then gave them his laws. That's a sign of their adoption, really, right? I mean, we give laws to our children, right? We make rules in the house because they're our children. We want to protect them, right? That's what God was doing. That was all grace. Granted, he did also give them the law to show them that they couldn't do it. They couldn't keep it. That they couldn't, obey God and follow all of his commands perfectly. It was meant to show them the bankruptcy of their ability, their complete inability to do it. And then there's many common evangelical views who just say, well, the law is just a guide. That's all it is. It just kind of gives you some guidance on, life, and it's no longer binding. So that's like, the variations are legion, okay, of sort of those common evangelical views. And some people just don't even know. Some people are, I don't know how it applies. I don't know how it works. So, and then there are, I guess I didn't include this, but some that are probably closer to like a theonomic view, very law heavy, very, almost like the cross is like this little footnote, at this big heavy law that has come down from heaven to steamroll us, and that's almost how it comes across. And so, because we're just prone to distort just about everything, this is certainly one of the things we distort. I think we just get everything all out of whack, and we emphasize one thing too much and something else not enough. But I think the confession does a good job of showing the importance of the law, how it's relevant even to the Christian life, but also avoiding the extremes, of being, seeing the gospel as a little footnote to this big heavy law that is coming down on us. So anyways, so those are and in the book there's 5 views. Some of them I didn't even know what to call them because it would have like the person's name and kind of long description of what they're trying to teach, and I didn't even know how to put that in just a title. What is that? I don't know what that is. So I just kind of lumped it in with common evangelical views. Should have said broad evangelical views because there's a lot. Okay, so before I move on, any thoughts so far on what I've already said before we jump into what the specific sections teach? That was a little bit of an introduction to the whole section here.
I'm going to try to let other people talk first.
Because well, no one's jumping,
The whole thing is actually like a rabbit trail or a red herring from the whole point.
Yeah.
Almost all of that. Because if you look at it from the big picture, what is the purpose of the law? Why did God give it to us? What is it supposed to do? And first, there is the civil use of it to show us right and wrong, how we should conduct ourselves, and to have a conscience as a society, so that we have a standard that we can look at to how to conduct ourselves with other people and
right.
to God.
Right.
And I think, and that's and then the next thing is, since God is perfect and the law comes from him, then it really is an expression of who he is. When we look at what the law is, particularly the 10 Commandments, but not just that, all of it, it tells us something about who God is.
Yeah.
Since we can't see him with our eyes, he's given
Exactly.
us his word.
Yeah.
And in the things that he tells us to do, in that he's trying to get us to be conformed into his image, he is showing us who he is through the law.
Mm-hmm.
And he would never ask us to do something that's apart from who he is. So
right.
in all of the commands then, and then the third purpose of the law is to convict us and show us where we're not.
Right.
And that we need grace.
Mm-hmm.
And that in every point we have committed us. If we break one law, we've broken them all. And there's
right.
not a single one of them. And that was the whole point when the Pharisees came to Jesus and they said, which of the laws is the greatest commandment? And they were trying to trick him. They wanted him to pick his favorite one to condemn people by. That's what they wanted to do. And he said, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. And the second is like unto it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And he didn't make that up. It came from Deuteronomy.
That's right.
The second telling of the law.
That's right.
So, the whole point then is, what does the law signify? That God is love. He wants us to love others. He wants us to love him. And in all of those things, the big lists of do's and don'ts and permissives and whatever is all some way helping us to show and to improve our love for God and for other people. And if in any way that we interpret the law that it doesn't make us love other people, we didn't get the message.
Right.
We're wrong.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. If it doesn't lead to love for God, love for our neighbor, then we missed something here. We didn't add something up right. That's right. Good. All right, so that first section there talks about the fall. Actually, I think that's a hangover from a retyping or reformulation of that section. Somehow I didn't delete that. So the first instance of God giving his law is in Genesis to Adam as the covenantal or federal head of the human race. He had the ability to keep it. We talked about that, right, previous sections. And had the responsibility of passing it along to his offspring. So Adam was sort of like the prophet in his immediate family, right? So when Eve was created, he was the prophet to her, as well as her husband and so forth. He was to proclaim God's word to her. And the word was, you should not eat the tree in the middle of the garden, tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because on the day you eat it, you shall surely die. That was the word that he was to pass along. And then after the fall, God's original command, essentially to obey him, which really is how we show love, right? If we love God, we will, keep his commandments. After the fall, God's original command was expounded upon in the form of the moral law, 10 commandments, and he also gave them the ceremonial laws related to the worship, the temple worship and so forth, cleanliness laws, the dietary laws, those sort of things were all part of the ceremonial law. And these were abrogated in the New Testament. Notice it says that these were given to the church under age. That's what it's the word. Yeah, underage. They were under 21, so they couldn't. They were restricted. Well, but that's essentially what it was, right? So a lot of what it's saying is the pedagogical or the ceremonial laws had a pedagogical function to them. They were meant to teach them some of the very basics of holiness and of obedience and so forth. So that's why it was given to them as the church under age. They were the church in its infancy. It was Israel. And then God also gave them judicial or civil laws, which were particularly related to Israel as a theocracy. And since the theocracy is defunct, those laws have expired and therefore not binding, except for the general equity that might apply in any given situation. So an example of that would be Deuteronomy 22:8. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, that you may not bring the guilt of blood upon your house if anyone should fall from it. So how many have parapets on their roofs? Anybody? No? Lawbreakers?
I've made sure that they fall really good and hard so there's no lawsuit afterwards.
But you still have the guilt of blood.
That's right. You still have the guilt of blood, right? Yeah. Right. Okay, so obviously, what would the general equity of this be then? Okay, it's given in a certain context when they built houses where they used the roof, okay, for gathering, right, for eating, for whatever. It was a part of their house. It was a functional part of their living space. So it was expected that people would go up there. So he's saying make sure that it's a safe place for people so they don't fall off your roof. Okay?
You don't feel bad if they fall off the roof. You have a fence up and they fall off the roof.
Right, then it's on them. Right, okay, right. I agree with that. Right,
Fell
yeah.
asleep out of the church window.
Oh, we just read that with the kids last night. That's so funny. Yeah. We just read that chapter in Acts. Right, so I don't know, maybe the owner of that house where Paul was with, the guy fell out the window, he might have been guilty of, not protecting people.
You gotta fence your windows.
Well, okay, so the general equity then would be just protecting life, right? I mean, this does go back to the Ten Commandments as well, about not killing. So if you look at you should be reading the Catechism questions on that as well, in the law. I don't know I can't remember where we're at in the syllabus of where they occur. Okay. Right. So the questions about the law, and so some of the as far as keeping the commandment on killing, also involves the protection of life, right? Protecting people from harm goes right along with it. So if we're not protecting people, so really this is just an application of that law. It's just showing them how to apply it. That doesn't mean you have to have a parapet around the roof of your house, but it does mean that if you, if you're inviting people in your house, you should be making sure they're safe. That you have a duty to protect their lives. So that is what it's saying. So that would be the general equity of a command like that. Does that make sense? And then Section 5, the moral law is binding on all peoples, not just on believers. Cultural, national, and religious differences do not exempt a person from their obligation to obey God's law. And when people of other faiths worship other gods, it is a violation of the first commandment. The gospel does not grant an exemption from obedience to the law. In fact, Christ strengthened this obligation. Now that people debate that. That's a debate, in Protestant circles. Some people say that the moral law, even the Ten Commandments, was only given to just to Israel, and so it was only legitimate for them. So we don't, make people, follow the Sabbath, follow the fourth commandment, and that sort of thing. So, but even if we're not making them do it, they're still breaking it, right? They're still breaking God's commands, even if it's not part of our nation's moral code. In a sense, God does call this is not so much something that we want to enforce in the nation, but something that people as individuals are obligated to follow. So it does apply to them in those ways as individuals. They're not exempt from it. And that's why, last week, we looked at when Paul was preaching, he said, God commands all people everywhere to repent. Mm-hmm. He says this in Athens, right? So I think it was Athens. Yeah, I think that was right. So repent of what? Well, of not acknowledging him as God, right? That would really be the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. Repenting of having gods before him, the true and one and only God and Creator. And that's what he describes there, how God is the Creator. In him we live and move and have our being. And then he says everyone needs to repent. So he doesn't necessarily, bring out that commandment, but you can see that it influenced his preaching in that instance. So he is calling them to repent of not following the one true God, of not being a worshiper of the one true God. And also, the confession talks about how Jesus strengthened the obligations of the law. In Matthew 5, right? If you have, the Beatitudes, or when he intensifies, if you lust even after someone, that you're committing adultery in your heart, or if you are even angry with your brother, that you can be guilty of murder, these kinds of things, because you've murdered him in your heart, committing homicidal hearts, so he increases that to show that it's not just the outward compliance, but it's even inward change that needs to happen. And then just to expound on that fifth section there, the moral law is of use to unbelievers in the following respects: to restrain them from much sin, to convince them of their sinfulness and misery, to discover to them their absolute need of Christ and drive them to him as their all-sufficient Savior, and to render them inexcusable if they continue in their sins and finally reject the only Savior of lost sinners. And that's directly from Robert Shaw's exposition of the confession. And so this is how it can work with unbelievers. Now, there's limits to that, I think, too. But I have seen, I guess, is it Ray Comfort, who goes around and talks to people and says, so are you sinless? Well, no, I'm not. I haven't done anything really bad. Okay, let's break up the Ten Commandments, and he starts reading them, and you ever done any of this? Oh, yeah. So suddenly they realize they're not all that great of people that they thought they were, just by reading God's law. So I think that's a good use of it, a good way to do that. Yeah. Okay, any other thoughts about how it's useful for the unbelieving world? Certainly a lot of our laws are based off of the Ten Commandments. So, all right. And then section 6 teaches more thoroughly the relationship of the law to the believer. The believer is not just justified by the law. The believer is not justified by the law and cannot be condemned by the law, since Christ was condemned in the believer's place. However, the law is useful as a rule of life. And here's how. And you were starting to kind of get on that, the three uses of the law. As a rule of life, as a signpost to Christ, and as a restraint from sin. And I think, of course, the first two I think are the biggest, because really, I mean, it certainly can be a restraint from sin. And as we encounter the law, then we say, okay, I know I don't want to break this. I want to. But remember what Paul says too about the law comes, and then what? The transgression increased, right? So there is a side to that can backfire, where the law could potentially even stir up more sin and make me worse, right? Because he says the commandment came and then I died, and then I found I didn't even know what coveting was until I read "Thou shalt not covet," and then that's all I could think about now is coveting, because I read the law. So before I wasn't even coveting. So there is that side of it too. But I think that one of the most important is really as a signpost to Christ. I think is driving us to Christ. And he actually uses that term in Galatians, where he says, I don't think I put it in here, but he says that it was like the schoolmaster driving us to Christ. Showing us just our inability and our brokenness and our fallenness, showing us just how sinful we are. It's a mirror, in a sense, as well. When it talks about it as a rule for life, I think in some ways it serves like a mirror, where it shows us who we really are. Shows us the ugliness, shows us the brokenness, shows us all the imperfections, and then by doing that drives us to Christ. And then section 7, the law and the gospel are not at odds or contrary to one another. The Spirit of God, which inspired the law, wills that we obey the law in the power of the Spirit, not out of bare duty, but cheerfully out of love for God. Back to the whole love thing. So if you love me, you will keep my commandments, Jesus said. And then Paul says, I say walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. So the law says, okay, this is what you're supposed to be doing, and you can't do it. Not only can you not keep it perfectly, but even keeping it, even when you do keep it, it's not your power that's doing it. It's the power of the Spirit. So it shows us just not only do we not have the ability we don't have the ability to keep it, and any ability we do have comes from God in the first place. So we must rely on the power of the Spirit to enable us to keep His commands. So, all right. So, any other thoughts or questions about the law?
I keep doing that. I keep jumping ahead because
That's all right.
I honestly didn't read what was there, and so.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. You're
So
fine.
when you go back, I don't remember which one it was, like maybe 4 or something, and there was that really long one that just had so much stuff in it. But
6.
6 was the long one, yeah.
No, it wasn't that far, but down.
The confession itself, or
It's in this portion here.
yellow or white?
Yellow.
Okay.
It was saying that some of that stuff maybe has passed away, and then you had this list of, different ways that people believe about the law, right? That some of it has passed away. So there's this portion, and it's talking about, okay, some of it has been, and it was that crazy word that every time I saw it, I cringed. What did it call it? Abrogated.
Abrogation.
Yeah, abrogated, whatever. Okay, so.
Okay.
I don't
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
that.
Right.
But anyway.
Appropriation.
Approbation.
No, it said, what is it?
I said abrogated.
Abrogation here.
But
There's abrogation.
I had to look at it. It said repealed, abrogated. Abrogated.
Where is it? That's 3 under 19.
19.3. Okay. So,
Okay. Here we go.
yeah. So, yeah, ceremonial laws and different things, all of this kind of stuff. And all which ceremonial laws are now abrogated under the New Testament. So basically, this is why we don't take our children out and stone them for disobedience to parents.
Mm.
And this is why we don't do an eye for an eye and life for life, is because it's been abrogated under the New Testament.
Well,
Is this
those
what
are.
we're saying?
It's
No.
Speaking of ceremonial law, though, that's
Yeah.
not the same. It's not the
Those
moral law.
laws are under 4, the political, the judicial law.
So,
But there, you don't find many instances of them actually when
I know, but
of
people
them
always
taking
bring
people
it
out
up.
and stoning them for a whole pile of those things that are mentioned in Leviticus.
Exactly.
Right. There's no instances of a lot of that happening.
Yeah, so, I mean, everybody was aware that you could and you shouldn't, but they did, and they didn't.
and there are a lot of people who, I guess you could just generally call them hostile people, that will say the fact that we're not still doing that makes us the hypocrite. Because God ordered it,
Right.
Sure.
and
That's a
we're
good
not
point.
doing it.
That's a good
Yeah.
point. Yeah.
A lot of that stuff from Leviticus, the atheists just love to quote
Right.
and ask questions about. So,
Right.
when's the
Yeah.
last time you did it?
Right.
Right.
Right. I see you trimming the corners of your beard.
I know
That kind of thing.
We used
You got
that a
cotton
few
and
times.
linen.
Do you want us to take you out and stone you?
Right, right.
Hey.
Well, I would say as far as the stoning part, that's the penalty for breaking the law, which Christ took. So that's why we don't do it, is really because we've been set free from the curse of the law, right? Because, curses those who do not obey every word written in the law. I mean, that's what God said. And that's why Jesus was cursed. Cursed is everyone who's hanging on a tree, right? So he was crucified and hung on a tree to bear our curse, the curse for all the things that we deserve to be stoned for or put to death for, so that now we don't bear that punishment. Not only the civil punishment, but also the judgment from God, the wrath of God. We don't bear that. But in some ways, I think it does kind of overlap with the judicial side as well. So that's another reason. So we still have death penalty. I don't really always like how we do it, but
Yeah, I don't think we use the death penalty because it's harder to extract money out of people who are dead.
yeah, this is true. Yeah.
They like to sue people.
Well, and I have an issue with it, the death penalty, lethal injection, because it looks like a medical procedure. And a medical procedure, doctors promise not to do harm, and then you got to have like some medical professional come in and administer the lethal injection. That's just, that doesn't make any sense. And then it's all this concern about being, humanely treated and things like that. So I don't know. Anyways, I don't want to get on that rabbit trail, but sometimes the rabbits need to be chased, and sometimes they need to just be told to stay down. Stay down, rabbit. Yeah. Right. But very good question, though. Yeah, very good question. But and I think what you've drawn out there, though, is part of the reason why there's so much debate, because, because these, as far as like the moral, judicial, ceremonial, or civil and ceremonial, I mean, I agree with what it's saying, but sometimes, because they were entangled in a lot of ways too, and that's why people say, well, you're not doing this part, or you're not doing that part, you're just picking and choosing. And that's why it's really important to understand how they're abrogated in the New Testament. So we may not stone someone for a certain sins, but we might bring them under church discipline. So that would be the general equity, of applying some of that. So, all right. So, questions about the law, about how it's applied, anything? So we're all experts on it. All right. That was my aim. So, all right. It can be a tricky one because, and even when it comes to like specifically the laws themselves, the Ten Commandments itself, as far as how we apply them, let's just take the fourth commandment for instance, and that's going to come up again here in another section on its own. Religious worship and the Sabbath day. The Sabbath is a whole other area of contention and debate, even in our Reformed tradition. And so, the Westminster take on it is different than, say, the Continental Dutch Reformed take on it. They have different, like Calvin's view. Usually they follow Calvin's view of the fourth commandment is very different than Westminster's. So, we'll get into that when we get there, but even like when it comes to images, okay, you should not make a graven image. So, then it can we have Sunday school material that has, little drawings of Jesus in it? So there's debate all over about that. Church we were part of years ago, the ladies were making Christmas decorations and had a little manger scene, and they just had like a little circle it was supposed to represent the baby Jesus in the manger. It was just like a little circle. Oh, it's an image. It's an image of Christ. You can't have that, So there was all this fuss about it. So, you can get really extreme with it. You can, it just, people have different sensitivities to things like that. So. What's that?
What am I thinking? Liberties.
Well, that's next, actually.
Segue.
That's right. Yeah, good segue there, yeah.
Did